call Senator Dodson.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Social Securities Administration Amendment Continuation of Cashless Welfare Bill 2020, and I move the amendment on sheet 1166, circulated in my name. Labor opposes this bill, and its opposition is not based on ideology, the sort of warped ideology which drives this government. No, our opposition is based on evidence, and the overwhelming evidence is that the cashless welfare card and income management generally does not work. Yet in the face of that evidence, the government remains determined to pursue the cashless debit card because it's determined to punish the poor and the marginalised in society. This is get back. Get back to where you belong. This is get back to them. This is not snap back or come back. It's get back to where you belong because you have no value, no worth in our society. That's the message it sends. The government is even refusing to release the University of Adelaide report, which has examined the card's viability in the goldfields regions in my home state of Western Australia. That report cost $2.5 million, and we're having to consider this bill without being able to be informed about what it says. There can only be one reason for that, and that is the government withholding this evaluation report because it doesn't like what it has to say, because it's sure to be further evidence that this cashless debit card is not achieving the policy objectives and outcomes that the government has been touting. This is typical of a government that refuses to have its policies directed by sound evidence. A government that prepares to uphold discredited ideologies so that it can punish or adopt punitive policies. Not that everyone on the government side is backing this legislation. Last week, the Liberal member for Bass, for example, said, and I quote this, there is just not enough evidence that supports this program. This program is a game changer for those communities and individuals placed on it to justify the associated harm that it causes. And that member dissented from the vote the other day. That's from other government, the government's own MPs, and she's not alone. The Liberal member for Monash said he too has got problems with this bill. So how many others in the government's ranks feel that same sentiment, but haven't got the gumptions to stand up about this? Let me remind you how this business of income management began. It was back in 2007, in the dying days of the Howard government, when he was Prime Minister, and he had Minister Brough imposing the intervention in the Northern Territory. It was the most egregious example of bad policy in recent history, and with it came the basic card, which quarantined 50% of the welfare income of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. The basic card was born out of a state-sponsored racism, so that the basic card could target only Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. The Racial Discrimination Act had to be suspended. The basic card was basically discriminatory, and so is the cashless debit card, because it disproportionately impacts First Nations peoples. Let me remind you how the cashless debit card came into being. Back in 2013, Prime Minister Tony Abbott commissioned Andrew Forrest to advise on Indigenous employment and training services. The terms of reference for Forrest's inquiry were quite specific, and there was definitely no reference to income management of welfare recipients. Yet Forrest, in his report called Creating Parity, took it upon himself to devote a whole chapter on promoting what he called a healthy welfare card. How a billionaire mining magnate can assume expertise in welfare policy and be allowed to write his own agenda is beyond me. And that a government can contract out fundamental social policy takes privatisation to a whole new dimension and a dangerous level. It's a perverse way for a government to do business, deputising a privileged rich lister to design a program that limits the rights of the poor people, poor and First Nations people in particular, to manage their own affairs. Back in February, when the Prime Minister announced his new Closing the Gaps target, he said, and I quote, "To rob a person of their right to take responsibility for themselves, to strip them of responsibility and capability to direct their own futures, to make them dependent, that is to deny them their liberty, and slowly that person will wither before your eyes." The Prime Minister went on to say, "We must restore the right to take responsibility, the right to make decisions, the right to step up." Well, the Prime Minister and his government are doing exactly the opposite. The government has now pressed the get back button with this legislation. Where's the principle that's meant to be underwriting the Closing the Gap agreement between the government and the coalition of First Nation peak organisations, an agreement announced with such fanfare only a few months ago? This bill flies in the face of the flowery rhetoric that followed when the National Agreement on Closing the Gap was signed back in July. The National Agreement was meant to signal a turning point in the relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the government. It was meant to be based on shared decision-making on policies and programs that impacted the lives of First Nations peoples. In the past, Labor has been prepared to support income management under certain circumstances, but now we're opposing the permanent imposition of the cashless debit card because of the evidence it isn't working, and there's no choice for people. Let me remind you of the National Independent Study into the expansion of income management, which was published in February. The study ran over 3 years and was funded by the Australian Research Council, and the researchers came from 3 universities, Queensland, Monash and Griffiths. The findings are damning. The majority of the survey participants, 77% of them, reported that they had no trouble at all in managing their money before being placed on income management. 87% of the participants reported that they did not have a problem with alcohol. Most card holders felt that the income management was forced on them with minimal assistance and support to help them to use it to their advantage. And here's the real telling outcome of the study. People told the researchers that income management had not only failed to achieve and alleviate the challenges that were largely non-existent anyway, but it also caused financial and other problems that did not previously exist. Some of the main problems reported in that survey response were not having enough cash for essential items that were the most infrequent complaint, difficulty providing for children and other family members because respondents did not have access to sufficient cash, difficulties participating in the cash economy because of a lack of access to cash. It means many are unable to purchase second-hand goods, for example. The difficulties paying rent and other bills because of glitches with the processing payments, particularly with the cashless debit card. You'd think that with that evidence in hand, the government would consider this intrusive and discriminatory legislation. But no, let's crash on, they say. Let's not worry about the impact of the legislation on the most vulnerable of our population. We've got a restless support base to appease, a support base which doggedly wants to punish the poor. That's where this government stands, a punisher of the poor and the disadvantaged. There's no choice for these people. The evidence against income management is even more distressing when it measures the socio-emotional impacts. The ARC study identifies a strong theme from the survey data that many of those forced into income management had experienced significant decline in their mental health and well-being as a result of the challenges they faced navigating their lives on the card. Whether the survey interview were conducted at Playford or Shepparton or Ceduna or Bundaberg or Hervey Bay, the sense of shame and stigma was a constant point of discussion. Generally, findings from the survey indicated that most respondents felt income management had been harmful rather than helpful. That to me is bad public policy, and we're on the side against it. And what has this government done to prepare the people of the Northern Territory for the serious changes they'll have to navigate? Late last year, I received a delegation of First Nations people from Central Australia. They were upset at the lack of consultation about the introduction of the cashless debit card. These people were well aware that the use of the card depended on access to telecommunications and postal services. But in many remote communities in the Northern Territory, those fundamental services that we all take for granted here are simply not available. No matter how often the government might assert that there's been widespread consultation about the imposition of the cashless debit card, the people who sat down in my office that day and whom I see on the streets of Broome every second day of the week, if not every day of the week, as a consequence of these policies, left my office with a very different story. Those 25,000 or so people in the Northern Territory who are on the basic cards, more than 80% of them are Aboriginal people, are to be moved arbitrarily onto the cashless debit card. There's no choice for these people. And don't anyone be distracted by the government's argument that the cashless debit card is technologically superior and cheaper to manage. Well, who's benefiting from the card? Certainly not the people who are on it. Because no matter how sophisticated, user-friendly the technology might be, it still derives a policy that is punitive and discriminatory. Try living the life of some person on this card. Well, might you laugh, senators? Because no matter how sophisticated or user-friendly the technology might be, it still derives a policy that is punitive and discriminatory. Mr President, I say social policy that's driven by flawed ideology and runs counter to sound evidence is bad policy. First Nations peoples have been subjected too long to bad policy. They're fed up with government interference in their lives. They're fed up with being branded as irresponsible, lazy and unable to manage their own affairs. This bill disproportionately discriminates against First Nations people, and that means it's racist. In my mind, to support this bill is to support racism. This government goes on and about how it wants to do things differently with First Nations and not to them. Well, this is a hollow mantra, and this bill cannot be supported by Labor.
Thank you, Senator Dodson. It being almost 2 p.m.